So without further ado, Richard, a very warm welcome. It's great. Thank you for joining us this evening and giving up your time. And it's great to have you here. And as I say, be able to actually sit back and talk about the music in a more relaxed way outside of the recording sessions and the demands of the record labels for this, that, and the other bit of information. So you're very warmly welcome here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you.
So I thought what would be nice for everybody, just to give us a little bit of context, is if you could tell us a bit about your background and what was your musical training, where was it, and how did you get into composing, and tell us a little bit about your life in as a composer and perhaps the composers that have influenced you along the way.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I suppose it all started, as it does for a lot of people. I was a chorister at Ripon Cathedral in Yorkshire, and that was where I think I first came into contact with all the greats of the Anglican Church music. And I suppose there were two great momentous discoveries, I suppose, there for me. One was performing this music, which of course was extraordinarily beautiful and wonderful. And we sang everything from Plainsong through Bird, through Purcell, through to the present day. In fact, a lot of very contemporary music as well at the time. But I think also for me, what was important was that I started to think about why on earth would the composer write a piece like this? Why does Purcell sound like Purcell? And why does Elgar sound like Elgar? And what made people sit down and create something that sounds so distinctive to them and is so expressive and so communicative to everybody else, and also, of course, so wonderful to perform. And I suppose that was where it all started. And then I suppose I carried on as a performer, a singer, string player, etc., through my school years. And towards the end of that period, I got into correspondence with Benjamin Britten, who was really in about the last 5 years of his life. And it was at the time of some wonderful premieres of his works, particularly the operas Owen Wingrave and Death in Venice, but a number of the other of his great last works, including the Third String Quartet. And that was also extremely stimulating to be corresponding with a composer like that, whose music we had sung, and I had always made a huge impression on me. And that was a great stimulus to composition and set me thinking about how one might do this. And then I suppose lastly, fortunately, I went to Christ Church, Oxford, and I read music there with Simon Preston and Francis Greer. And they, of course, also were wonderful performers of music, but very, very interesting. And Francis, of course, Francis Greer himself, a most wonderful composer. So those were the real influences, I think. But I think it must have dawned on me very early on that if I possibly could, I really would want to go and be a composer. I wanted to see if I could actually write music as these great forebears had done.
Yeah.
So that was really how it came about. And after that, I carried on writing, obviously a lot of church music, but more recently some instrumental and chamber music, much more instrumental and chamber music now. And it's really just built from there, and had a lot of discussions with organists around the world and conductors of all sorts, and of course, Michael, your good self.
And so interesting when you mention, obviously, great composers like Britten, a real favourite of mine. And, Britten's work spans a huge period of his lifetime, a huge range of genre. And you were saying that you've moved towards some chamber music, perhaps later in your composition career, and you've composed choral music throughout all of that time. Would you say that your approach to writing choral music has changed, either stylistically or in any other way, if that's been one of the main staple genre of your output?
Well, it certainly is one of the staple parts of the output. It's very difficult from where I'm sitting, to put one's finger on the way in which stylistically it might have changed. I mean, so if you take the works on this disc, coming out tomorrow, which of course is hugely exciting. But I mean, these works um, are really, I think, characterized by a response to the words. So when I look back at some of these pieces, they're not actually stylistically very different, some of them, from what I'm writing right now. But there are also, on a couple of occasions, critics or people listening have said, oh, well, this piece seems to represent you heading off in a different direction. And that's probably true. You get that sense when I look back on one of the pieces, for example, of which this was said, I thought, yes, actually, if you looked at it from the point of view of a listener or a performer, and you compared this with what had gone before, it does look like quite a big step away, perhaps into a new direction. So I think probably one's become certainly more adventurous over the years. I think I've become more economical. I think I've become there's less. There's certainly no excess music in there anymore. It's very much directly what I would like to say. But as I say, sometimes stylistically, in fact, I've just finished a choral piece for a choir in Germany, and playing it through, I think actually, you know, this is quite similar to some of the early pieces stylistically. So it's a difficult question to answer.
Yeah, and I must say that actually when I was on my own going through the process of looking through your music, and we were then deciding on what we might program together, that yes, there are pieces that are stylistically a little bit different, but there isn't a great line in the sand between things that are obviously early work, perhaps, you know, one might say were naive or slightly less accomplished, rather than things that have been written more recently. So and I think that's a great testimony to your writing, that there is a sort of timelessness to it in terms of your output. I think it's time for a little bit of music, in which case, so I'm going to play the first of our videos tonight, which is one of the tracks off the disc called Creator of the Starry Height. Now, Richard, I'm going to hand this one over to you to introduce. Tell us a little bit about the piece. Where did the inspiration to write it from come, and tell us about the text, because actually, as you said, responding to the text is perhaps the most important thing, and this is an amazing text which I'd never come across until hearing this piece of music. So tell us a little bit about this.
Oh, well, it is an extraordinary text. It's actually a Latin 7th century text, and translated by the great J.M. Neale, who I think a lot of people will be familiar with in their hymn books. He translated quite a lot of Latin hymns. And this is a very famous Advent hymn. And it really talks about the transition from darkness into light. And so it's obviously specifically for Advent. It's very much about the coming of Christ and our looking forward to that. And the words talk of the desperate need of the world, if you like, for the Saviour. And the music transitions from a very quiet organ introduction through into a kind of narrative section with two verses, each with a solo, a soprano and a tenor. And then a couple of verses at the end with the full choir, where the organ is going full pelt. And the choir comes in with this sort of almost rollicking tune of feeling that the advent of the Saviour is close, as it were. The work was commissioned by St Edward's School in Oxford, and it came about in a rather strange way, because they were having a fundraiser for the development fund for the school, and the director of music said, "How about writing something for us, and we will auction this piece in an auction of promises." So they had an evening where they had, I don't know how many hundred parents in the main hall there, all bidding money for various things, various projects or committing whatever. And this was one of the promises that was auctioned. So it got auctioned, got written, and then they performed it in the Advent Carol service in the chapel of St Edward's School in Oxford, and it went off like an absolute firecracker. It was terrific.
Fantastic. It really is a kind of journey from 0 to 100 over the 6 minutes, isn't it?
It is.
So without further ado, I will put the video on now. I'm also posting this amazing text in the chat channel. So if you like to follow the words, then please have a look in the chat now, and I'll hand over to a little bit of music. Great, it's an amazing journey dramatically and musically over a very short space of time, and quite the workout for the organist as well.
Yes,
a lot of admiration for Jeremy, who did an absolutely sterling job doing all of that. For those of you who are interested, we recorded this in St Mark's, Regent's Park, sort of Camden, Primrose Hill part of London. And as ever, recording anywhere remotely near a city, it was done at sort of the depths of night, at 9-10 o'clock at night, to try and reduce extraneous noises from the outside. And we also did it right at the beginning of January, when things are generally a bit quieter too. There's a fantastic big 3-manual Walker organ in St Mark's, which is perhaps disproportionately big given the size of the building, but for this kind of music where the organ is such an integral part, it's a real coup being able to have an instrument like that to record it with. And as an aside, Regent's Records were actually formed. The guy that used to run the music at St Mark's Regent Park then started Regent, the record label. So it has quite the sort of heritage of recordings and recorded music in that space. So moving on from there, obviously a great and powerful religious text there, as we've discussed, but one of the things that I was very conscious of, as I think you were too, Richard, is that there should be a balance of sacred and secular music on the disc. Of the several sacred pieces, 2 of them are canticle settings, the Idis Christi and the St Paul's service, Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis, and obviously those texts being the real cornerstone of the evensong liturgy. I really wanted to include both of those settings for reasons that are very obvious to us, but would you explain to everybody why we obviously included those, because they're such well-known religious texts, but why those 2 settings, and give us a little bit of background to each of those?
Yes, thanks, certainly. Well, these 2 were written within a space of about 3 years of each other, and were both in response to commissions from Stephen Darlington at Christ Church Cathedral, Oxford, and the late John Scott of St Paul's Cathedral in London. And one of the wonderful things about putting these 2 canticles on the disc is that they are, although they're exactly the same words, and very familiar words, of course, to anybody who's used to evensong, as you say, the musical settings are quite different. The Christchurch setting is for upper voices, so really trebles in 3 parts, really, mostly in 2, but in some instances in 3 parts. And the St Paul's setting for lower voices, altos, tenors and basses, and this was what the 2 organists requested. The style of the music is utterly contrasting, because Christchurch, of course, is a very small cathedral and with very little acoustic, as opposed to St Paul's, the huge size of it and the huge acoustic gives a completely different kind of environment in which for these pieces to be performed. So the Christchurch one with the boys has got a lot of energy, it's got a lot of drive, it's got quite jazzy bits in it. It's all very light and thrusting and quite exposed, a lot of it. But you've got a combination of virtually no acoustic and the Riga organ in Christchurch, all of which give you great opportunity to have some fun with something a bit more interesting, a bit more lively. The St Paul's, of course, is completely the opposite. It's a much mellower work. It's one where you've got to take account of the fact that things will get caught up in this huge acoustic, and making it clear and the words clear and the music clear means that you've got to be very careful in how much sort of dynamism there is in the writing. But funnily enough, they've both been performed in other places and they work perfectly well elsewhere. But the contrast is there really because of the very different nature of the buildings and the organ, and also the sound of the choir. The boys at Christchurch trained in a particular way to sing in that building, to be effective in a building like that. And the same is true, of course, of St Paul's, where it's a different matter, but nevertheless has to be very specific for the building.
I liked the fact that these 2 settings provide a bit of an anchor to the disc as well. One of the dangers with programming CDs is that you end up with 28 tracks all lasting a minute long or 2 minutes long, and it can sometimes be very hard to provide a bit of structure. But actually, you know, a Magnificat and a Nunc Dimittis, you've got two contrasting texts straight away, which are quite big texts, and we've got two contrasting settings, as you've just described, which I think complement each other really, really well and provide a nice sort of anchor and structure to the programming of the whole disc. So moving aside from those big sacred texts, two of the secular numbers on the disc that I was particularly drawn to, one was the setting of the Stephen Crane poems. Now, I didn't know anything about Stephen Crane, and these settings are in marked contrast in the way you've written them to some of the sacred texts. Could you just tell us a little bit about these amazing poems and how you approached your music making in response to them?
Yes, you're quite right. And this work, the four poems of Stephen Crane, is the most recently completed work on the disc, written in 2013. Well, Stephen Crane was an American writer, better known for his fiction. And he wrote one particularly famous book called The Red Badge of Courage, which is an account of the American Civil War. And it is an astonishing book for its depth in terms of it follows one particular individual and their experience of the war. And it really is quite a harrowing story. Crane himself died at the age of 28. Having written a number of books, and he's even less well known for his poetry, funnily enough. But the same questioning, if you like, within the red badge of courage, in his, for example, in his fiction, which is the internalization, if you like, of what we are experiencing. This also filters through into his poetry. So these four poems are really variations on a theme, if you like, of an examination in many ways of the nature of the relationship between mankind and God, or man's search for God, if you like. And so they explore different aspects of that search. And I just thought I would use the piano here rather than any other kind of instrument, and have this as a kind of series or a little cycle of part songs, effectively, for choir with piano. But they do form an almost sort of sonata-like structure in a way, with the third movement being faster and lighter and actually unaccompanied. And that's really where it came from. And I think the idea was to see if the music, and the music is it's more challenging than some of the other works on the disc. But rather like Crane's poetry, if you make the effort and go in and listen a few times, then these things start to come out at you, and you start to begin to get the picture of the whole piece. And there's quite a lot in there. I absolutely love the poems, and I'm very fond of American 19th century literature. So it was in many ways a natural choice, and I found these very, very stimulating pieces to set to music.
And segueing nicely to another text that is a sort of a reminiscence on life and God and mankind, King Henry VIII's Apologia, I think is just a wonderful text, and it is apparently attributed to the king himself. It's the most amazing setting musically. It's incredibly virtuosic, and one of those pieces that's difficult on paper and even more difficult to really pull off and do a good performance of. But just give everybody a little description of this amazing text for those who don't know it, and I didn't know it again before coming across your setting of it.
Yes, well, this text was allegedly by Henry VIII, King Henry VIII, who was the founder of Christ Church, Oxford, and it was who commissioned the work for the 450th anniversary celebrations. So Stephen Darlington, who was the director of music, said, we need something sort of Christchurchy or Henry VIII-ish. And in fact, he sent me a copy of the text. He said, I've dug this out of the library. Whether or not it's actually by Henry VIII, we don't really know, but we think it is. and but have a go. And I mean, it's an absolutely lovely text actually, because he is, and hence the title of my work anyway. He's really saying, I'm really not such a bad bloke, you know. You guys are really down on me. I've only done the same things that everybody else has done. When you were young, didn't you go and do all these things as well? And when I married, you know, I'm serious about marrying, and all this sort of thing. So it's a way of him, if you like, explaining perhaps some of his indiscretions. And it's really rather amusing. And so and he takes us through various different elements of his life that he is trying to relieve himself of blame for. And so the piece is in sort of four or five sections as we go through these, with a little refrain at the end of it, which says, and some people say that I'm governed by my youth, as if to say, how ridiculous could that be? And so it's a lovely little piece by him. And so I thought, I've got to put this can't be a kind of withering violet piece. This has got to be something that's out there, and where he's standing there with his chest, you know, beating his chest about how clever and brilliant he really was.
Absolutely. It is the turbocharged Ferrari of choral. It's an absolutely wonderful piece. And who knows, maybe we'll rewrite history slightly with our communication of these words, if they are indeed by him. So your music is published and distributed and performed across the world, and has been for many years. The process of actually recording music is a more permanent and in a way defining process, because live performances exist in the moment and then they go, and every performance is different, and every choir and every conductor and pianist and organist is different. How do you find having your music recorded? Is it quite an inhibiting process because you're immortalizing one person or one group's version of the music? Does it impact on you at all, or actually is it just a very nice way of approaching having your music performed?
Well, I certainly don't find it remotely intimidating. I love it. I think it's absolutely great. And it also actually, this gives me a wonderful opportunity actually to thank you and the London Choral Sinfonia for the incredible commitment that you personally, but the choir as well, have shown to all this music. I mean, it really means a huge amount, because the thing is that it's no use writing all this music if no one ever listens to it, or if it doesn't mean anything to anybody. And so this immortalization idea, yeah, it's very important. I don't mind in the slightest that you have chosen to interpret these pieces in this way. And you've done so without really veering at all from what I would consider to be really authentic and brilliant performances. And I don't think one should be afraid of the fact that other people might take these pieces and do something different with them. And very often, actually, you asked about what does it feel like to hear when the things are being recorded. Well, I mean, very often I'm hearing things that I haven't actually heard since I first wrote the piece. And that's wonderful. And you suddenly think, oh yes, I remember why I did that now. And isn't it great that this conductor or this choir have got this particular way with this music? And for me, one of the very experiences of these recording sessions was watching you and the choir and the organist and the pianist kind of working through this into this repertoire and finding such a great way to express it, and all the connections that there are between these various pieces. So I'm not at all worried about the recording. I love the recording process. I think it's great. It means that your rendition, your interpretation of these pieces is there. And the most important thing, I think, from the composer's point of view, is you've got to. It's a great privilege to be able to work with such great performers, and we have to trust you to do it. And of course, the results are wonderful.
Thank you. It's very kind of you to say that. And I must say, I will add that I find the recording process actually very rewarding. An outsider may look at it and think it's terribly fragmented and a bit unnatural. But actually, unlike a rehearsal for a conventional concert, where in the performance itself, you just have one shot at it, and that can bring all sorts of excitement to it, don't get me wrong. But in a recording environment, you can just keep going back over and doing it again and doing it again. And I think when the atmosphere is right, you can have that electricity and that charge in a recording context, even without an audience. I think if the stars align in a recording session, they can be as exciting and as rewarding music making as a live concert can be.
Yes.
Anyway, we're going to finish now with our second piece, which is Spirit of Mercy. Richard, could you introduce this for us and tell us again about the piece and its context and the text?
Yes, this is Spirit of Mercy. The words come from the Foundling Hospital collection in London of 1774. So we don't know the identity of the author, excuse me. This was one of two anthems that I wrote, funnily enough, not for a commission. So this was just, I found two texts. One was called Palms of Glory, and the other one was Spirit of Mercy. And I just thought, I liked the text, and I thought I'd see if I could set them. So that's how it came about. And in fact, because I didn't actually have any performance in mind when I wrote it, there was quite a long gap between the completion of the work and its first performance. It was actually first performed in South Africa. And I must just tell you, I mean, the South Africans absolutely adore this piece, especially the black South Africans. And there are a number of concerts, I can tell you, I've been to, where this thing's been performed, and they've literally been sort of up on their feet, you know, shouting and clapping and everything before the piece is even finished. So it's a very, again, it starts very quietly, and it builds up into really a sense of wonder at God's glory, and these wonderful words. And so it started off life actually as a piece just for upper voices and organ. And then at the behest of the Chamber Choir of South Africa, who premiered it, I made it a version for 4-part choir, which is the version that we hear on this recording.
Super. I'll press play now. Great, a really, really wonderful piece of music, a real favourite of mine there, which just leads me to say thank you again so much, Richard. It's great to actually talk about the music and hear your thoughts and some of the background to all of it.